Hello everyone, welcome back to the Grasshopper VRay tutorial series. In this session, we will focus on setting up the necessary components for our VRay rendering. Before that, I want to mention that in between the previous video and this one, what I've done is to group the previous components together that makes up the animation and just called it animation setup. Hidden some of these lines, display hidden to make it a little bit neater. This one I kept disabled because it speed things up a little bit. And that's about it. It's basically tidying up the previous code script in order for us to continue into this one. So without further ado, let's have a look at what we'll be doing. We'll be mainly working on setting up the timeline in order to get the VRay Render component working. So actually, let's start off with the VRay Render because then we'll know what we will need for us to do our rendering in VRay. And then we'll set up the lights after that. So first off, have VRay installed, and then you will have these components in your Grasshopper. And if you go to VRay Render and you put that here, this is the main engine that does the rendering, and it has a lot of inputs that we need to connect to. But there's actually quite an easy way to fill some of these out for us, which is if you right click on the icon, you can click on show controls, and what it will do, it will populate a few of these so that we don't have to go in and manually create the controls or that's necessary for the input. So obviously, let's start with the first one, the engine. If you have an NVIDIA card and which has RTX capabilities, which are basically NVIDIA Series 2000 or 3000s, then you can choose this, which will be a lot faster. But if you have NVIDIA 1000 series, like a 1080 or a 1060 or along those lines, you can use CUDA, which is still a lot faster than CPU. But if you have none of these above, or because you have maybe AMD graphic, now I'm not sure if AMD is able to work with these, but then you probably have to stick with CPU in that case. But because I have a RTX card, I will click on RTX because that'll be a lot faster. And for the mode concern, we'll be sticking with interactive because that allows us to move around, change some materials, and that will display in our rendering in real time. And when we are ready to do the final render, then we will put to production. So we'll leave this as interactive. As for the sampler, the same story. If you're doing interactive rendering, it's best to leave this as progressive. And when we're going for production rendering, we'll switch this to bucket in the end. Quality basically controls the quality of the image you will see. For testing purposes, I tend to put this to low or one of these. We'll leave that as medium and see how that will fare. Likewise, if we are ready for production rendering, we'll probably put this to high or high plus. And lastly, the out image. This is basically control where do you want to save each frame of the animation. So if you double click this, you can set a folder, you can set a name inside a folder, and it will treat that as your output location. So if you double click, it will end up opening a browser, which you can then set to a specific location on your computer, and it will render that out. So for me, if I select one of these, so these were the frames where I saved it. What we can do here for these are the frames for the previous test rendering. I can make a new folder and just say VRay output. So that's going to be the folder name. As for the file name for each frame, we can put this Kinetic Rain. You don't need to put anything behind it because when VRay Render, it will automatically add the incremental values, the numbers behind the frame number. So we can just leave that as is and we click save. And now we'll be focusing on the rest of what the VRay Render engine requires. So the first one being the output resolution. This kind of speaks for itself because it's asking for the resolution. So what I tend to do is I will make two panels, like so. First off, I'm gonna insert my monitor resolution, which is 3440 by 1440, which is an ultra wide. So yours might be, for example, most common one will be 1080. So those will be this. If you have a monitor that's 1080, which has a ratio of 16 by 9, ultra wide has a ratio of 21 by 9, I believe. So choose whichever one you want, and then we'll stick with that. For testing purposes, what I also tend to do is I want to make sure that I'm able to scale my resolutions depending on what output I want to aim for. If I want to do test rendering, I don't want to do full resolution because that takes too long just to see how it looks like. For the production render, I might do this, but we'll have to see how long each render will take. So to put in here, what I only have to do is you can basically do this, and it will accept those two values. But like I said, I want to be able to control this, the percentage of the resolution I want to render. So what I want to do is I want to do a multiplication in here, so that I can multiply these values and output another value that will be the final resolution that I'll be rendering. But to combine these values together, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to just open up an entline, get rid of this one, and then connect the R here. I do want to flatten maybe this one, yeah. And then I'm going to add 0.1, 0.1, smaller than 1. So this will be my scale, right? So at 10% of that is obviously just divided by 10. You'll get this as a resolution. Now I can plug this into my output resolution. So I'm going to have a super mini frame if I want to render this at 10%. But at 50%, it will have this resolution. So that's for your mileage may vary because you probably have a different resolution. So you might want to play with this, and when you're ready for production render, you can choose to either leave it at 50, 60, or any percentage you choose, or 1%, or even more than that, if you really want high quality frame for maybe 4K, 8K, stuff like that, or for maybe just a poster, or for a very short video but at super high quality, or super high quality and super high res. So, and then we'll move on to the rest. The camera, well, this is where we connect a VRay Camera node to it. So for now, I'm going to leave it as empty. Or actually, what I want to do is we'll extract this parameter. We'll let it have this name. What we're going to do is then what we can do is when we are connecting the camera, we don't have to run the wire all the way through all this and then connect here. So this will just make it a little bit cleaner. I might as well just move all these here so that they're a little bit cleaner. Move this on here. And then, yeah, the bifocal is making this a little bit messy, but it's to show what components are used here without showing the full names. I'm going to do the same for light rig actually. So I'm going to actually extract, or actually don't want to because I don't need to name it light rig. Or actually, wait, made a mistake there. We don't really need the light break. If we leave it at unconnected, it will just pick the default light rig. So, and that I found works okay, but instead I'll make one for the lights. Just connect here, and I'm going to name this light, or you could have just right click and extract to parameter, but I will do that for this one, so I don't have to type it in. Well, we don't need to flatten with it, so because it's already flattened on this side. So we have the camera, the light, the VRay Geometry. Same one goes for the timeline. So I'm gonna give that a name. As far as the elements, this is where you want to plug in like a denoiser in here. For example, this one, or a light analysis if you are interested into that. But what we will do is we will add this denoiser, because what it will do is it will, if you're rendering at a resolution or your quality is low, the denoiser will smooth out some of the noises in order to make that even smoother. And from my experience, it works really, really well. So I'll just include that in here. You can right click on this one and show controls, and you will see additional controls that you can use. So I tend to leave these as default. So I didn't even have to take these away because they already take that as default. So maybe we'll just do that because I know I won't be changing anything. Okay, so these are more or less the inputs that the render engine needs when it is ready to render. But now if you press this, nothing's going to happen because there is no geometry connected to it. But what we will do for this, we're just going to create a scribble and just we'll call this VRay Render. Actually, I forgot what size, 80. So we'll make this 80 and we'll group this. Okay. Now with that done, we can go back and see what we need. Well, first off, very important is we need the timeline. So that's what we're going to focus on, and we're going to put that around here. So if we go to, where was it again? Here, render, VRay Timeline, put that onto the canvas. Now, up to this point, there are one thing we have to keep in mind, which is in here, we changed the values in order to incorporate to 600 in order to incorporate the test animation we did. So we have to change this back to what it was, or what we want it to be. And that will be that. Yep, okay. For the VRay timeline, it's actually starts the same, because if you can drag this and it will basically act as a slider. It is actually, you can see this as a slider with a little bit more inputs to it. So the first one being the frames, which, well, if you read the subscription, the description of it, it's the number of frames that exist within the timeline, and we have to write here. So what we can do is we can actually connect that in here. But before we do that, what I would want to do is connect it first to a data component. Well, actually, let's take a number because I want to make use of the expression of this one because the data does not have that. So we'll give that name. Okay. Right, so the total number of frames can go to here because that's how many frames we have. And you can see that the timeline changes now from 0 to, if I zoom in a little bit, 3,599. And whilst in here we have 3,000, we have one extra frame. So what we want to do now is we can do +1 on this one. and it will give us that extra frame, but we might want to keep it at this one, or to comply with the series here, we could just do that actually. We could just do that indeed. So let's put in here expression x plus 1. So now you can see it reaches all the way to 3,600. But that will mean that we have 3,601 frame. Now the start is, well, we can make a start. We'll just actually, we'll make a new slider. Now actually, I'll just copy this one instead. What the start will do is it dictates where the animation will start when it starts to render. So if I put in something like this, it would mean that the animation is going to start at 505 frame, and it will not render any frame that's prior to that number. It's good when your rendering has suddenly crashed and you're up at like a certain frame, and then you can just edit this, and then it will re-render the animation, and the animation will pick up from this frame forward. So usually you want that at 0 because you want to start at the beginning. As for the ending frame, well, this is a little bit weird because it's not asking us the total frame and the start and end, but I believe the purpose of this is the same as this one. Although, well, ending frames are never rendered, so I don't know why we want to. Maybe you want to, for people who want to render a subset of the total timeline, that will be necessary to dictate an end frame. But we want to render the whole animation, so we'll just use a total frame indeed. Now this is going to be red. The reason being that we are not saying we have 3,601 frame, but we're ending with 3,061, which is actually not true because the last frame, as we can see here, is actually 3,600. We have a total of 3,601 frame, but our last frame is not 3,601 because we're starting with 0. So what we have to do here is right click on the end and say x minus 1. And then you'll see that it changes back to the normal gray, meaning there's no more error. And now you can notice that it's darker gray. And this is what I explained here, is the part that's dark gray is what it will render in the end. So we'll put this back in 0. Another tip for the timeline, if you want to go to a specific frame number, if you have a lot of frames, it might be hard to drag and finely tune that. For example, I want to go to 1390, but I can't. So what you can do is right click here and you click on current frame, 1390, commit, and it will go there. Right, so with that, let's have a look at the output. Well, the timeline, this one goes to the timeline. So we can actually just connect that here. The frame is actually the number that you see here is the current frame. The fraction is actually a remapped value from 0 from the start to the end, mapped to a domain 0 to 1. It might be useful for other purposes, and we are going to use that, I believe, at some point. Okay, so with that done, this is now set up, but Grasshopper needs to know, or we need to build in a switch that tells us which one are we using, because if we're using the current frame here, that means that we are not using VRay, because we are moving our base mesh with a single slider because it moves with this one. So we need to switch between which of these is going to be responsible for moving this base geometry. So let me put this actually back to 0, not so way to the end. Because if we move this one, let me actually enable this. or actually get that one, you will see that now this doesn't control anything. It's still controlled by this one, right? So we need to make a switch that switches between these two modes. And we're going to use our trusty filter gate with a toggle. So this one will be to say use VRay. If it's false, that means obviously this one is now 0. So if it's false, then I want to use this one. So it will be connected this way, right? But if it's true, actually, I might want to move all this a little bit to that side. I don't want the text to move, because in the end, I have to connect the frame here back into here, like that. Okay, so watch what happens if I now switch to use VRay. Suddenly, it will look at this one. So meaning, this one doesn't do anything. See, my base mesh is not moving. But if I start to mess with this timeline, you'll see that it moves accordingly. So now it is using the number that comes from the timeline, and because this timeline is now connected to that, VRay will render out the appropriate frame for the appropriate position for the droplets or the position of the base mesh. Okay. Actually, let's test this out. But if you go in here, you can, if you want to render a still, you can basically click render, but that's not going to work yet because I failed to mention that we have not connected a light camera or any geometry. So that still doesn't work. My apologies for that. But this does make the first initial step that we need to make in order for us to render this animation out. So let me actually put this back to 0. And the next one we're going to be focusing on is getting up the camera, the VRay camera. So that is in VRay Camera, this one. Let me now actually explain this one. The same thing we can do here is right click and then take all the controls. Well, that's not really a lot. As for the type, I would leave this as standard. Stereo also off. So actually we don't even need to see these. So let me delete that. As for the type, maybe I don't want to see that too, because the default value will be okay. Now the position is where the position of the camera will be, and the target is where the camera will be pointing to. In terms of FOV, which is the field of view, you can mess with that. So I'm just going to put in a slider of, let's say 15 to maybe 18, something like that. And I'll default this to 50. The tilt, usually you don't want tilt on your camera. The tilt, well, we can have a value there, and then you can see the tilt value. But we're going to set this to 0 to, let's say, 5.0. It basically controls the camera's, I would say rotation, but that's not really it. It's tilting. That's what it is what the word actually say. But for now, we just set that at 0. Auto zoom, I'll leave that as is. The exposure, I would also leave that as default so that I don't actually need these. Now these numbers, if you're familiar with DSLR or mirrorless, you should know what these, if you're into photography basically, you will know what these numbers will do. But for now, we'll leave these as default unless we have to adjust brightness within our animation. But most of the time, we'll probably be adjusting those with our lights values. So let's connect this camera to camera. Or the angle, we don't need it. So we do need to now do these two. For that, I'm going to make 2 points. I'm I'm going to connect those 2 points here. For quick intro of this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on a point and say set one point, and I'm basically going to set a point. If I open up that one, so position of my camera is going to be something like here maybe, and where the camera points is going to be somewhere in the middle of my the raindrop, the installation. If you switch to the front or the side view, you can adjust the height of the camera. So if you click on, let's say, this one, the position, you can actually increase the position and height, and where it points also a little bit up, so it actually points towards the droplets and not towards the ground. I might have to put in a different view to, let's say, this one, and I'm going to disable this one so you can actually see roughly where it points towards. Okay, so that's with the rough camera setup. Later on, we're gonna make the camera animate slightly, like moving along a rail or something like that, and then you can see, and you can actually animate the camera as well, the position and the target of the camera alongside with the droplets. Okay, so that's for the camera. So the next one will be, let's focus on the VRay Geometry. Now for the geometry, we obviously need to go to geometry and say VRay Geometries. Well, for this one, we could do show controls, or well, it's not really a lot. Let's see what we get. We actually get nothing. Okay, well, the geometry, this is where the droplets will come in. So we'll look for our droplets geometry, which will be these. Now I see we didn't make any outputs for that. That's okay. So we'll do geometry, and we'll connect this one up in here. So we'll call this droplets geometry. We actually create one. Oh, that was a misspelling. Geometry. There we go. We'll also get that from the, it's not here, but actually here, from the lines. So actually this time I'm going to enable that. But this is not that. We'll just call this strings geometry. And then immediately I'm going to get these twos out. I'll add these to the group, and then I'll drag these. Maybe I can move this up in here. I'm going to drag this one here. First off, I'm going to ignore the strings. I'm going to attach just the droplets geometry first. As for the material, there are a few ways to do that. You can either create a simple material with a few parameters. I wanted to check if there's show control, but there's not. Or you can actually import from a file, or you can use one that exists within the project. But that means you have to create one in Rhino itself. That I found is the easiest because of the preset that VRay has. Actually, do we have this one? No, this one is a different way of creating it. I don't think, yeah, this is a different preset. So what we'll be using is actually the VRay material from project. We click in here, then we'll connect that to the MTL, which stands for project material. Now, if you drop down, you will see that we don't have any material because we didn't create any material for our Rhino project. So we're going to do that first. If you have VRay installed, you can go to the VRay toolbar. And if you click on the VRay icon, it will launch the VRay menu. Mine is actually bugging out at the moment. Oh, no, it's not. Let me switch to GPU. So if you're wondering what I did there, if you hover your mouse on the left and the right, you see that you can expand the menu a little bit. So on the left side is where you will get the material, on the right side is the preview of the material you selected. So we're going to search for copper. You got all these. I believe the one I used for the rendering was polished. So what you're going to do is just drag it to the middle section, and you'll see that we have copper polished. Now previewing, and if you go back to Grasshopper, you can see that we now have copper polished to be selected. Now I'm going to duplicate this, obviously, and then replace that geometry only for the string. Well, the string is not going to be copper. The string can be something else. I think I searched for white, and then I got the translucent white strings. I think it was this one. So if I drag it in here, I think this is the one I selected. But of course, you are you're welcome to select your own. If you want, you can even browse through any of these and then select the strings from there. Paper, plastic strings. I think this is the one that plastic. Yeah, this one I already have selected. So I think I'll just go with that again. So I'm just gonna click here and change that. Now I can close that one. Now, now we can actually connect these two to the VRay. Oops. To the VRay Geo. Now we don't have any lights, but we do have a default light already set up for us. So what we can do is just preview how that looks like. So I'm going to expand my perspective a little bit. I think with all this selected, we have a frame where, well, this one is a little bit different. So that's okay. And now if you, and we set our resolution to half of what my monitor size is, that's okay. Now if you click render, don't do render animation first, because what that will do, it will just render the entire timeline. But instead, just do a normal render. And it takes a little bit while for VRay to fire up. For the initial rendering, what it will do is it will do some calculation here and there. And actually, that was quite quick. So now if you, well, this was supposed to move as let me double click and get rid of those quickly. Oh, right. Well, this is what it looks like for the dropper. So if you're happy with the material selection, then, well, you can leave it at this. Else, you can just modify it. One thing I've thought that I've set up is I mentioned that with the interactive, you could just move around and it will update automatically. But the reason why it wasn't updating is because I've now set a particular camera with one position that it no longer is able to sense that I'm moving my camera during render time. But what I needed to do instead was to direct the camera to its default, meaning no connection here at all. So it will just take my Rhino render view as is. To achieve that, we're going to use a filter gate because we do need this position later on for the final production render. So what with the filter gate, what we're going to do is maybe let's say this one, use VRay Cam. So if the answer is false, meaning no, then it will be 0, so it will be nothing. Actually, I might have switched to talk, but that's the same thing. But if it's yes, then I wanted to use this camera, right? So I'm just gonna connect this here and I'll connect this to 1 because now it says yes. But if it says no, meaning nothing is connected. This camera is not connected. But watch what happens if it's not connected. So I'm going to do another interactive render. And there we go. And now, if I move around, you can see that my Rhino now, or the VRay now automatically updates. Like so. We can actually even go and change, actually, let me put this aside and go to the original and say, yes, use full points. Now I hope my machine is not going to crash. Oh, it almost did. And now I can see what it looks like when it's rendering the entire thing. Well, obviously there are some issues with maybe some of the lights. Well, it doesn't look like, but some of the droplets are in the wrong position, which tells me that introducing this many new geometry during render time is giving VRay a little bit of error, because this does not match what we see there, obviously. So I'm going to turn that back off. A quick, easy way to fix that will be just to restart the render, by the way. But since I know what the issue come from, I don't need to re-render that. So I'm just going to stop this instead and go back to my render. And let's see what else. Well, we're going to stick with the test camera for now. Actually, no, we're going to use the other one because switching is quite easy, so we don't really mind that one. So we don't really, if you want to switch, you can just come in and switch. Oh, I was going to show the FOV in the tilt, so let me actually redo. Actually, go back to no use that. Oh, I can't switch the camera, but I can do this. Let's see if it does allow me to change. Yes, that does allow me. So the view of view is, if you play video games, first-person shooters, you'll know that the FOV is usually set at one of these values. Is what you see. Is you can see this as a camera zoom. Of course, the higher, the more sort of like fisheye effect you probably get, or the distortion on the side. So we'll leave that at a reasonable value, 50 or 35, depending on which one will suit us best when we do the final render. And as for the tilt, you see that the camera is like tilting left and right. So negative value obviously tilt to the other direction, which is why I mentioned it's best to keep this at 0. Unless you want to do artistic tilt rotation of a camera, then this is the option to change that. I'm going to stop this render. Okay, so at this point we have the very basic things set up already. So the next one, what we can focus on are the lights. Now, in my render, in the first animation I made, is I had lights set up sort of in an invisible ceiling, right? Actually, I'm going to draw that with my pen. So I had a few lights set up. The first one being the ceiling lights, where I had a very tiny scattered randomized light on the ceiling that shines downwards towards these droplets. And then I had, I think, another fill light at the sort of like the bottom of the, actually, let me switch to this view. Maybe they'll be a lot better to explain while deleting the other ones. So at the top, I had a lot of, actually, let me use the same color, a lot of ceiling lights, right? Very randomized ceiling lights. So if you were the top, you would probably see something like that, like that, like that, like that, and like that. And then at the bottom, I had a fill light, which was something like a bigger light, softer light that sort of like illuminates the bottom a little bit. And if you want, if you're using the lamp model like I did in the lamp model rendering, what I did there was within each lamp, I put in a very small rectangular light or circular light since the newest update of Rhino for VRay. I mean VRay for Rhino. I'm getting all the names messed up. So those are the basic light condition that I've set for the rendering that you see in the animation that I made. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to try to replicate this ceiling light first. I used a few inputs from the points in order to generate where the ceiling lights would be. But you don't really have to do that. You can just set one point because your the droplet is not going to be moving anywhere. But to make sure that everything is parametrically the same thing, is driven by the same inputs that we set here, we'll take the points, which is this one, to give ourselves a starting point basically for our lights. So I'm just going to move that all the way here because I want my ceiling light to scatter roughly from the center of this. So I'm just going to use an average to get the middle point roughly, also from the top. And then from here, I'm just going to create a plane, XY. Actually, I'll create a surface plane, surface construct. I want a surface that allows me to quickly create plane surface. We'll take that. And then from the plane surface, we can supply in XY for our domain, how big we want the plane to be. So I'm just going to say domain and domain construct. This one. I'm going to put them both there, and I'm going to give it a number slider. Obviously, the A will be negative because we're making a domain. So now we can play with the values. So if you're happy with 10,000, that's we can leave it at 10,000, but we can also make it a lot bigger. So I'm just going to make 30,000 the maximum limit. You know what? I'm going to set this to 1,500. And within this one, we can create greater points. So we can either do a randomized point, like so, or we can create a grid of points that are following a grid pattern, basically. For that, what we're going to do is, well, we have two options. We can either stick with this one or go to the other one, which will divide our plane in equal section. And then we will, from those sections, we're going to take the points like so, which is a really rough sketch. But this is by far the most easiest. I think I might even leave it to this one, actually, because it's so easy. And the lights, well, we don't see the lights, so we don't really need this to be very uniform. So I might reduce this to just 30 lights. We'll see how far we can get. Okay. And now we have the grid points. So now we can actually go back to VRay and do rectangular lights. Well, the position is going to be the points. Now for the lights to point downwards, as you can see, they all have an arrow. So now they're all pointing somewhere randomly. So if you want them to point downwards, so the simple way to do that will be to just move these points down. and by using a negative set value -1 and apply that to the target. Now you can see that all the lights are now suddenly pointing downwards. And then for the color, what we're going to do is we're going to make up a swatch. Apply that. Actually, I'm going to apply this all to the lights. I'm going to make this maybe a cool color, like a light blue-ish. Maybe that's not enough. We'll play with this later on. Intensity, well, this is how bright you want the light to be. And the invisible, actually, let me show control. Take that. And the invisible meaning if the camera sees the light, well, it sees like a bright light bluish spot. And we want that to be invisible. So it does give off the light, but you can't see the light source itself. And this one is new. I think these 4 last is new to the latest version of VRay. Before then, it was just the shape, but you couldn't change the shape, which was kind of weird. Now you can change the shape. If it's rectangular, you can change the UV size. I think the disk is the same, that you can change that one too. I'm not sure about this one, but the UV size was mainly for the shape of your rectangle. And the directionality is a new variable, which already exists actually in the standalone plugin for Rhino itself, but not the Grasshopper component. It actually controls how soft the light beam is going to be. For a rough value, we can start it. It starts actually with 0, so the edges of the light beam is actually quite sharp. But if you increase it a little bit, it gets a little bit softer. Not that it makes a lot of sense for our rendering, because our lights will probably need to be very bright to exert that, and we need a shadow in order to see that, or some kind of fog. But I tend to put this at not 0 to create a little bit subtlety, a subtle light softness. Okay, so with that done, I think we're using VRay Cam. We are still. We can re-render a test. See how that goes. Let me see. Let's put in a intensity. I believe 60 was the default, so let's put in intensity here. To increase that, you still don't see anything. Oh, right, that's because our lights are extremely small. Like, I can't even see it, just a point. So we need to increase the size of our lights. We're gonna make it rectangular shape, but then we're gonna supply actually one value, making it a square. So if I quickly hop on to this one, you can still see that they're not so big. So I'm just gonna increase this by like that. And now you will start to see the reflections on our droplets, which makes it a little bit shiny, as if it's, well, as a lot of light shining on it. That's very basically what it does. I think I'm happy with 1000 for these spotlights. Or actually, what might be interesting, because these lights are now shining down, but they're shining down on nothing. What I might want to do is actually maybe get rid of this and have all the lights shine towards the installation itself. So for that to happen, to work, I'm going to stop this for now. What I want to do is actually use this average point and move that down instead. So if I use that instead, you'll see that the light now suddenly points towards that light. But watch what happens if I introduced a slider that's maybe 100 smaller than 10,000, because I know our ceiling height is 10,000. So if I plug it in here, I do need to make the F negative because I want to move it down. So if I move this down, you can see all the lights now follow that installation. This will make it so that all the lights will shine to it. Now let's just see what that looks like. Render. Might be too bright, so I have to decrease this by a lot. Okay, let's see. 60 was the default. I think 60 will be enough. I think I might even put this to, oops, 500. Because I only want to have these very subtle reflection on the copper droplets. So I'm just going to increase this back to 100, like so. Okay. Okay, I'm going to stop that for now. I'm going to hide the lights, hide that too, hide this too, hide that too. And I'm going to tidy up some of these, maybe in the off of the recording. But as far as the setup for the lights for the VRay concerned, we are almost done to animate this. Actually, you can already animate this. It will output the animation on this based on this timeline, and you can see it all happens. But we're going to take this a little bit one step further, which is to make our camera also animate. Maybe our camera will maybe start with, if I switch to perspective quickly, maybe our camera will start somewhere here, looking here, and then it will make a round trip, maybe somewhere like there, and then it will point there. During the entire animation, our camera will move that path. So in the next video, we're going to check out how to do that. And in between, I will tidy up some of these components, give them in a separate group, hide these lines, and make these a little bit cleaner to look at. So we'll do that and finish this, hopefully finish this up in the next video.